Hi, this is Ken Skank, your professor, and I wanted to give you my 2 cents on how the transmission of the biblical text might relate to our theology of Revelation. You all, except for maybe one person, I think maybe Tony, I think you all answered this question with the two kinds of philosophy being textual and linguistic. And that is correct in terms of approaches to translation. It just isn't what the question intended. Now don't worry, because when everybody in the class gives a correct answer, but it's not the question the professor was asking, that's obviously the professor's fault. The curriculum has not posed the question clearly enough for you to know what it's asking. The situation is that we don't have any of the original manuscripts of any biblical book. And there are two basic philosophies that are used by scholars to determine how to, what Greek and Hebrew text behind the English. See, we're not talking about translation here. We're talking about what Greek text you start with to begin with. Because if you're translating one manuscript, you end up with one reading, but if you translate another manuscript, you come out with another. And so we're not even talking about translation here. We're talking about what's called the transmission of the biblical text. The fact that as copiers copied and copied and copied, errors entered into the text. Or some of them weren't errors, in the sense that sometimes copyists intentionally changed things. In fact, the best evidence indicates that for about the first 100 years of the New Testament being copied, copyists felt very free to clarify things. And you have to think about the fact that this is an oral culture. This is not a literary culture like we are. They didn't learn to read. The overwhelming majority of people, maybe 90% of the people in the ancient world, were illiterate. And so these were oral documents that were not written to be preserved exactly the way they were. That's just not the way they thought about it. I know we like to talk about how careful the copyists were, but that has to do with the Masoretes who copied the Hebrew Bible in 900 AD, over 1,000 years after the Hebrew text was written. The best evidence suggests that the earliest copiers of both the Old and New Testament felt completely free. To paraphrase, think Eugene Peterson, that the earliest layer of New Testament copying involved free translation like the Message, in order to bring the message about. And so these weren't malicious changes. There's a guy named Bart Ehrman that talks about the orthodox corruption, of the text. Well, he's lost his faith. Of course, he would view orthodoxy as a corruption. But really, these copyists were trying to clarify, and probably for worship. I mean, it may have been somebody as simple as, I do this with my children. When I'm reading the Bible to my children, I sometimes paraphrase on the fly, knowing that they don't know what the word propitiation means. And so the earliest period of New Testament copying involved a good deal of freedom in the wording. Most of these changes did not change the meaning. They didn't change theology, but they did change the wording. And so, now there are some people who disagree with what I just said. If you're a King James person or a New King James person, there is a group of scholars, let's call them majority text scholars, who would say that that basically we should count the manuscripts. The assumption there is that the majority of medieval manuscripts from the Middle Ages were worded exactly the way the Bible originally was worded. And so if you agree with that philosophy, you'll use the King James or the New King James. That is not, however, what the vast majority of the experts in this area think. And so if you use an ESV or an NIV or an NASB or an NRSV, or if you use any version except for the King James, you pretty much are using a translation based upon a scholarly reconstruction of what the most likely original Greek and Hebrew text was. And it's not exactly the same as what most manuscripts read throughout the Middle Ages. And so here's where theology comes in. Because if you're using any version but the King James, then your implicit theology is that God was not worried about preserving the exact wording of the biblical text, that the message was far more important to God than the exact wording. That's the implicit theology in using an ESV or an NIV or any modern translation. If you use any, in fact, if you use any translation at all, because of course you cannot translate word for word from one language to another. If you use English to read the Bible, then your implicit theology is that it is not important, it was not essential to God for the word for word exact wording to be what was the locus of revelation, but that God is concerned with the message and with the concepts. If you use a translation, Muslims do not use the Quran in translation. They insist that anything but the original Arabic, of course, what they don't know is that there are the same textual issues with the Quran that there are with any ancient text. But they would say that if you're not using the original Arabic, you're not reading the true Quran. If you are a King James person of that sort, now there's nothing wrong with King James, I'm saying a King James only person. A King James only person, to be consistent, should not use even an English translation. If that's important for your theology, you should be reading the original Greek and Hebrew. And so that is something of what I meant when I talked about there being an implicit theology to translations, especially if you're using any modern translation. But even if you're using a translation at all like the King James, then your implicit theology is that it's not the precise wording of the original text that was important to God, but that the message was what was important to God. Again, the King James philosophy, King James only philosophy. Again, nothing wrong with King James. I'm talking about those who insist it must be the King James. The theology behind their approach is that God would not have let the majority of manuscripts to differ in any way from the original reading of those manuscripts. Well, I hope that clarifies it a little. If it doesn't, I hope we can have a very good discussion. Thank you, and welcome to the course.